Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens.
Welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Today, we'll recap Donald Trump and Ursula von der Leyen's appearances at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, which both were last week. We'll also dive into the current state of the EU's Digital Services Act and how the bloc is trying to regulate tech giants. Finally, we'll turn to a conversation with Federico Rampini, global columnist for the Italian daily newspaper Corriere della Sera, to discuss Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, the state of the Italian economy, and what the second Trump administration means for Italy and the EU. We hope you enjoy the show. Max, we are off to the races with big speeches last week at Davos, just a few days after President Trump came back for his second term. A lot was said, a lot of grand announcements. What was your take on his speech at Davos?
Well, in some ways, the first week of the Trump administration was sort of uneventful for Europe in some respects, that there weren't the tariffs that many people were potentially fearing or expecting. But then on the other hand, I think the vibes are all bad. And I think that where we're at is a situation where there's going to be a real collision coming in all different ways. And at Davos, I thought what was interesting was, Trump goes to Davos and he says things that he had said before. He said that the EU is unfair towards the U.S. and that the relationship is imbalanced. Quote, the EU does not take our farm products, does not take our cars, yet they send cars to us by the millions, end quote, and that the EU treats us, quote, very, very unfairly, very badly, unquote. Now, we've heard all that before, but I think what was most interesting about Davos was von der Leyen's riposte, where she hadn't been heard from for a month because she was sick with pneumonia. That was its own scandal because the EU didn't reveal where she was, and then she was in a hospital. So, glad she's back, but I think it also sort of reflected there was not really anyone sort of minding the store in the commission because everything in the EU sort of revolves around her now with how she structured the commission. But her speech, I thought, was very useful because it comes at a point where everyone is just crapping on the European economy, saying, man, Europe is so weak, it's divided, it's economically going nowhere. And there's a lot of truth to it, but I think then we're about to see what Europe's going to do about it. And I tend to think Europe does things when things are really crappy. But what she highlighted was that Europe is going to want to have good relations with the U.S., but we're also going to try to adhere to European values, also open to engaging with the Chinese, sort of highlighting that Europe does have options. And I thought it was a rather strong speech that highlights that Europe is not going to be totally pushed around in this new Trump administration.
Yeah, that's the hope. And that's definitely the two ideas that were in her speech is we'll see how things go. We want to engage, we want to discuss, but we are prepared to protect our interests. This is similar, as you were saying, to what we heard in the first Trump administration. The spirit of what he said is similar to the first Trump administration. I think what's different is what we've seen for the last week and a half is the willingness to take action that is way outside the usual things that we would see from a U.S. administration, including a Trump 1 administration. So hopefully the Europeans are getting ready to veer more towards the protect our interests camp if it gets to that. You said something, I think, in our last podcast, more on the security side, a very 19th century view of the world. And this feels like that to me for Trump's speech. It's a very 19th century view of the economy as well. It's just tariffs are the tool that we are going to bat around for everything and trying to intimidate other actors. And we saw this over the weekend with Colombia using the economy to force partners and other countries in the world to do what we want in any other category of policy, not just the economy. So I think Europeans should take this seriously and prepare for it. Another thing that they should really take seriously is what he talked about around deregulation. I think there's a lot of competition coming the way of Brussels in a way that I'm not sure they're quite ready to address, but it's going to have to. As you were saying, usually being in a crappy situation is what pushes them to action. I'm really hoping that's the case. All of these conversations we've been having around European competitiveness, the Letta report, the Draghi report, if Trump is serious about these deregulation plans and also what he talked about around, come to America, we'll give you super low taxes, that is a massive competition challenge for Europe at a time where they can't muster the economic and fiscal space to push this competitiveness agenda forward. Despite, there's new economic security tools around investment screening, et cetera. They're beefing up there, but they really need to beef up on pure competition because I think Trump is not playing around when he says those things.
Yeah, the European economic weakness is coming at a very bad point. But I think the real question for the Europeans is, are you weak and feckless, as the Americans presume? I think Europeans need to understand that, like, this town in Washington thinks that Europe is weak and feckless and can never get their act together about anything. And that I think what the Trump administration assumes is that Europe will just bend the knee on every single policy issue because Europe is weak and feckless and we can just push them around. I don't think that's going to be true, and I think there's going to be a big backlash. But I think what we've seen thus far is Europe sort of keeping their powder dry, trying to figure out how to respond. But I don't think Europe is going to be able to do what it did in Trump 1, which was Merkel kind of led the ostrich effort, which was to just stick European heads in the sand and then hope that this would all sort of wash away. Yes, every once in a while we'll have to go to a stupid G7 summit or a NATO summit, and we'll have to be with this guy that we can't stand, and it will be like going to, Christmas or Thanksgiving dinner, and you just get through it with the relatives you don't like, and then you just move on with your lives. That's what everyone was sort of hoping for. But no, this is going to be intense confrontation. I think one last point on this is that by picking a fight over Greenland and with Denmark, who is one of the most pro-American countries, also, historically fairly Eurosceptic, and Mette Frederiksen's going to Berlin and Paris now and basically saying, like, look, guys, if they come after, Legos and Ozempic, we need the EU to back us up here. And so I think what is going to emerge here is a stronger European response that I think may surprise the Trump administration. That's maybe a good segue to talk about tech policy, because one of the most shocking visual things of the Trump inauguration was just seeing all the tech billionaires, or oligarchy as it's now being sort of referred to, sort of in the front row in front of the cabinet secretaries. Elon Musk now has sort of a White House pass. And this is going to be a huge confrontation because the EU has this thing called the Digital Services Act.
And other pieces of legislation as well, Digital Markets Act, there's CBAM coming our way. Anyway, take your pick. Honestly, the tech regulation exemplifies just that it's a fundamentally different approach to regulation between the United States and Europe. And we can talk, ad nauseum about whether that impedes European competitiveness. I will leave that to better scholars than me on those issues. But it is a new area of collision potentially, because the Digital Services Act has now been in place for almost 2 years. And some of the really big tech companies like Meta and X, formerly Twitter, are under investigation from the Digital Services Act. So we should say the DSA is really focused on content moderation online and also making sure online marketplaces that they're not selling anything that's illegal or dangerous, goods that are not allowed to be on this market. So there's a lot there. There's disclosure requirements, algorithm disclosures as well, which is part of the issue with X, for example. And Meta is more about protection of minors. These are the laws on the books in Brussels. So those companies, they were already starting to do this under the Biden administration, but I think it's going to be their moment under the Trump administration to really say, look at us. Europe is persecuting us because we are the big American tech giants. But the reality is just Brussels wrote these laws. These companies are infringing, perhaps, depending on the results of these investigations, on these laws. It's not persecution because these are American tech companies. It's because of how they've built their business model. But that might be another area where the Trump administration, now that it has all these friends around the president, might want to pull the trigger and say, well, if you keep doing this, then we'll hit you in a different way. And that's really concerning because that's where the rubber meets the road for Europeans is, are you going to try to affect the investigation to quell the resistance from the Trump administration? Which, to be honest, we've seen similar dynamics in the past around investigation of Gazprom, for example, where the rules were the rules and the commission managed to have some kind of agreement that made it okay for everyone involved. Perhaps this is where we're headed, but it is a tricky situation.
Yeah. And look, I think two things can be true at the same time, that like the EU wants to regulate the tech companies because they're potentially social harms and uncompetitive business practices. And some of the EU rules that the tech companies complain about, stifle business, stifle creativity, are really difficult to adhere to and maybe ill thought out at times. There's truth on both sides here. What I would say is that it seems really clear that American tech companies think this is a huge priority to change and to go after and hit the Europeans and confront them about what they consider to be egregious regulations of them. And we see here in the United States, any effort to kind of regulate the tech companies by Congress, there's like a flurry of activity, and there's a reason why we have no tech regulation. And so they hate European tech regulation and want that to go away. And there was a very interesting interview between Mark Andreessen, claimed Silicon Valley venture capitalist and inventor of Netscape. His interview with Russ Douthat was interesting is that 3 points that he highlighted that he was looking for from the Trump administration. First was like, basically leave us alone, so don't regulate us. The second was like, effectively go after the European Union because we need to be competitive globally. And then he mentions the EU. And so it's this contradictory thing where the American tech companies are like, oh, the Brussels effect, where the EU passes regulations and has this global, world-shaping power. Oh, that's like, BS. But on the other hand, oh my God, it matters so much to us because this is the second largest market for our products because, we can't really sell them in China. And so this is a big priority. And the way they're thinking about this is through blunt force action on the part of the Trump administration, attacking, going very aggressive, and Elon Musk leading the way, but then also Mark Zuckerberg highlighting this as well. This is going to be a huge confrontation. And the question I would ask the American tech companies is like, what's in it for Europe? This is the part that I have difficulty understanding. Like, what are you really offering? Maybe certain companies, Apple, Google, okay, but like social media platforms, Blue Sky just developed. The US literally just took down a social media platform in TikTok and then sort of put it back up. But if you buy a new phone, you can't get it. So like, why does Europe care about having Twitter or Meta or Facebook in the EU? It could just ban it and create its own European one. This isn't like rocket science here. We're talking about a social media platform that has network effects, and granted, it's there. But if they're not going to adhere to European standards, then what's in it for Europe? I think one of the things that there's a lot of talk about, and if you listen to Ezra Klein's recent podcast with Chris Hayes, talking about a lot of folks are like, well, there needs to be backlash against the fact that we're addicted to our phones, addicted to social media platforms. And so when Twitter is clearly violating the Digital Services Act with its insane algorithm now, like, why wouldn't Europe want to essentially, quote unquote, protect its citizens from this platform? The question that I would then ask is, it seems like Europe economically could probably benefit from this. So in an era of tariffs and retaliatory measures, this just strikes me as like they're putting themselves out there, but I think they're getting way out in front of themselves. And there's potential for, I think, this to be a huge collision and go very badly for American tech companies in Europe. I think they're making probably a big mistake. I could be wrong, and who knows, maybe I'm wrong in judging how the EU is going to actually go about this. But what political constituency does Twitter have in Europe?
I agree with that 100%. I think your question around what do tech entrepreneurs think is in it for the EU, I think you're assuming a lot from them. And like the likes of Mark Andreessen, these are people who don't understand the part of the concerns in the EU that relates to democracy and protecting citizens from this unhealthy attention obsession with the social media platforms and our phones, etc. To them, they don't see it that way. These are tech optimists, I think, and obviously capitalists as well, who see the dollar value of this attention economy. So considering the possibility that there are leaders who are worried about the effects of these things on their citizenry, I don't think that occurs to them that often. They only see the positive of it, except we're now getting into a space where the costs for a lot of people are starting to outweigh the benefits of those. And I think you make a good point on, what's in it for Europe, increasingly less, because other than Ireland, very few EU members see a lot of actual tangible economic benefits from these platforms, except maybe entrepreneurs who want to sell on the marketplaces. That's a different thing. Amazon is a different category because it's not a social media where basically the product is the human and the data. So that's a little bit different. On the response of the Europeans, I agree to some extent that what's in it for them. I also am curious, though, to see these regulations really start hitting. They are an experiment, Policymakers see a challenge and a concern, and they try to make rules around them. And it's possible that now that we're a few years out from those, they look back and start thinking, okay, maybe we were wrong about this. Maybe we need to tweak that. So if that is the direction they're taking, there could be an area where they can pretend to hand a win to the Trump administration and some of these tech people when really that's something that we're going to do anyway, because they want to make some changes because they're realizing actually it hurts competitiveness. They do want to have some level of deregulation of some of these marketplaces because it's good for the future of the European economy. That's the only scenario in which I could see some movement as they realize, just like a lot of people in the center right to right wing in Europe are starting to rethink some of the Green Deal regulations. If they are going in that direction, they could always pretend that it was also to appease the Trump administration.
Right. I guess before I get a lot of email from some of the tech companies saying this is how many jobs we create in Europe and all that. I guess it's more for me that kind of replacement value, where if we are in an era of state-backed tech competition, which is sort of how AI is being treated, as this intense competition between the US and China, with Europe completely out of the game. Now, Europe did miss the boat totally on the tech boom. In part, there's, lack of capital markets union, so you don't have the venture capital pools. There's not a single market really when it comes to technology. Everyone speaks different languages. The social media scale isn't there. If you have a French social media platform, it's not going to be that popular in Germany. So they had all these sort of basic challenges. But in the era of kind of state-backed technology companies, where if Europe needs to, get in the game on technology policy, why not set up protectionist barriers and just try to effectively start building more of a tech economy? A lot of the US tech companies have sort of led the way. And then you see platforms like Blue Sky, still an American company, basically just looking like a lot of the other social media companies. I think this is going to be an incredibly fascinating place to watch. I will admit, I'm not the foremost expert on all the tech regulations. I think this is something that we should have some real experts on in future podcasts, because this is going to be an area where, just given the closeness politically of Silicon Valley now to the White House and how much they care about this, which I think was in some ways sort of surprising to me. I knew they cared, but I always thought it was like fifth, sixth, seventh order priority. No, I think this is going to be really top tier in the confrontation that I think is coming over this and many other things. So much to discuss.
But this makes me also wonder, just from the European perspective, all of this closeness in the United States and just a lot of debates around what's happening in the Trump administration among the population could actually be an interesting moment where there would be support for some kind of European social platform. I'm just not going to lie. A lot of Europeans are looking at what's happening in the United States and say, I don't want anything to do with that. It sounds pretty great then if we can have a social network of any kind that is insulated from the Wild West that some of these platforms are becoming here. Why not try this? And then you would have cultural backing for a new tech effort in the EU. Now, the last thing I'll say on this is, obviously, as with anything with the Trump administration, it will ultimately depend on which faction of his entourage wins out, because there are some real ideologues who want to throw tariffs around all the time, and some are very anti-tech. And then there's a lot of real business interests who are close to the president because they see value in it for themselves and for their shareholders, but don't want to get to a state where there are tariffs everywhere and there's a really bad relationship with the rest of the world. So, what is bluster? What is real? Trump administration is really trying to seize the first few weeks where all the cameras are on them and, messaging to their base. We're doing all these things. It might taper off a little bit down the line. That's really the big question here, is figuring out how everything's going to fall into place in a few weeks. And out of those factions, who's going to have the ear of the president and how the different parts of the government can be leveraged one way or another. I think that's a great place to turn to our interview with Federico Rampini to talk about Italy in a little bit more detail. We are thrilled to welcome Federico Rampini to the Eurofile. Federico is the US-based global columnist of the Italian daily newspaper Corriere della Sera. He was previously U.S. chief correspondent of La Repubblica and is a prolific nonfiction writer and essayist, having written over 30 books. Federico, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So let's start with an overview of how Italy has been faring since the last 2022 election. So at the time, a lot was said of one of the parties that's in power now, Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, and that election in 2022 brought them to power. So since then, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who we've seen a lot of, has really become a dominant figure in European politics and, as we've seen very recently, in transatlantic relations as well. I'm curious how you would characterize her tenure in Italian domestic politics and how Italians have been seeing her mandate. Obviously, there are other parties that are in the government, but hers is the most visible and she is the prime minister.
So I wouldn't say that Giorgia Meloni's domestic achievements are her strongest point. Probably she's perceived as a strong leader by many Italians. I would say a majority of Italians, not just a plurality, but a real majority of Italians think that she is a tough and very assertive leader on the international scene, that she has deserved the respect of many foreign leaders. Italians are proud of her for that. I don't think they would consider her domestic achievements as a triumph. I mean, what did she run on? Well, on immigration, she's still probably on the same page as a majority of Italians in wanting to restrict and regulate immigration. But she hasn't really achieved much for a number of reasons, because there are legacy of rules that make it difficult, for instance, to implement deportations. There are European constraints. So she hasn't really done much on that. On the economic side, I would say Italy is one of the best performing economies in Europe, but because the other ones are so bad. Compared to Germany, which is in a recession, Italy is doing comparatively well, but it's not a fantastic economic performance. On social issues, she has proved to be divisive. We have in Italy the same kind of cultural wars that have divided the American society, very, very similar topics. And so she is on the, let's say, on the conservative side or on the Trump side with pretty much the same effects, that Italy is very, very divided. These are divisive issues.
That's really a helpful overview for us to wrap our heads around. At this point, it's 2025, and so 2 and change years into that tenure. I want to drill a little bit on the economic part of it, because obviously, within the European debate, Italy was long seen as one of the enfants terribles of the EU economic standards, especially after the crisis of the 2010s. But per your telling, things seem to be going a little bit better, although admittedly, as you said, the bar is lower now. I'm curious how you've seen the government navigate the post-pandemic inflation and, importantly, the effect of Russia's war in Ukraine, including on things like energy prices. We know on sanctions, Italy had a lot of business with Russia. So how has that impacted the economy, and how has the government managed these crises?
So you rightly mentioned the fact that for a long time, Italy was one of the worst member states of the European Union in terms of public debt and public deficit. Now, this is not true anymore. Once again, I will almost repeat myself, not so much because Italy has been doing better, but because others have been performing much worse, especially France. I would say that the major comparison here is with the dire state of public finances in France. So that Italy nowadays is almost on average. It's not really a country that would be singled out as burdened by too much debt and deficit. There are so many others. Italy is in good company. How did Italy economy manage to navigate the post-pandemic inflation, the effects of Russia's sanctions? First of all, let me nuance a little bit what you said about the economic relation between Italy and Russia. It was never very important. As a matter of fact, Italy has its main economic relations, be it trade or investment, within the European Union. And the second partner is the United States of America, by far. Russia has always been a minor partner. China is a little bit more important than Russia, but not very important. China has never been for Italian companies, Italian businesses, as important as a market as it was for Germany. So, because Italy is mostly a European-oriented economy and an Atlantic-oriented economy, it was not so difficult to manage the impact of the sanctions against Russia, except for energy. We have a problem with energy costs because, yes, we were importing a lot of cheap Russian gas. Now we have replaced and substituted Russian gas with gas from other suppliers like Norway, Qatar, and especially the United States. But US natural gas has to ship through the ocean, so it's being liquefied and it's much more expensive. So nowadays, Italian companies can pay their energy bills as much as 4 times or even 5 times as high as a comparable US business. we have a handicap in terms of competitivity because of energy costs. And also we pay the price of domestic mistakes. Italy completely abandoned nuclear energy. Now, many Italians would be in favor to relaunch nuclear energy. It will probably happen, but it will take time. And we also have had a lot of environmentalist regulations that limited the extraction of natural gas from our own soil or our own offshore supplies. Italy is, especially in its most dynamic regions, which are in the north and the northeast, Lombardy, the Venice region, it's very much intertwined with the German economy. So Italy has a big problem, which is called Germany. Because the German economic model is in crisis, Italy cannot really manage to have a very dynamic economic growth until Germany get out of its own crisis.
That's a really important point. And I think, unfortunately, in a lot of other countries in the neighborhood of Germany are facing similar challenges because they're so dependent on the German economy. And honestly, in Europe, a lot of people are. The point you made on the abandon of nuclear is also very interesting. I mean, I'm originally from Belgium. The government there has spent 20 years debating the exit from nuclear energy, and we're still delaying. But ultimately, the goal is to get out, whereas in France, the impetus is going completely the other way as a source of energy that is not fossil fuels. So I think that's a debate that's going to keep going, unfortunately. But your point on Germany and energy and competitiveness is a great segue into the next part I want to talk about, which is Europe and Italy's role on the European stage. We've seen Meloni really take a bigger role. She seems to have a good relationship with Commission President von der Leyen, was pretty important also in the negotiations around the Commission and the so-called top jobs. I'm curious how you see her role on the European stage. I mean, there's a lot of really important debates happening now on things like competitiveness, but also investments in defense. Obviously, Italian industry has a lot of stake in energy, in defense, in other areas of competitiveness. How do you think the Italian government can push its own interests there? And what is the thinking in Rome on all of these issues?
Well, first of all, European policies are one of the fields where Meloni accomplished utter transformation of her own political stance and her own political image, because she leads a party that was originally rather anti-European. Now it's not at all. So she has become the leader of a conservative party that is very much a player in Europe and in the European Union dynamics. So now if you have to find an anti-European party, it's the smallest junior partner in the government coalition, the League of Matteo Salvini. But Giorgia Meloni, as you rightly pointed out, she has an excellent relation with Ursula von der Leyen. She has become a major player in European politics, also because of the weakening of the two traditional leading countries. Germany and France nowadays have such weak or non-existent leaderships that, of course, Italy is also advantaged by a power void in Europe. And Italy is trying somehow to fill the void. But Italy has its own limitations. And I would say that investments in defense are one of the weakest points in Meloni's performance as a prime minister. Italy has never seriously come near 2% of GDP in terms of its defense spending. Although Italy committed itself to that target in 2012, that was when Barack Obama was president of the United States. And still now, after 13 years and after the Ukraine war, Italy is barely at 1.5% of its GDP in terms of defense spending. That's a big problem. There are explanations that would even justify Meloni being a laggard. Italy has a very pacifist public opinion. Italy comes from major political traditions that are anti-NATO and openly anti-American. I mean, the fascists, of course, which were originally, let's say, where Meloni comes from. Italy used to have one of the largest communist parties in the world until the 70s and the 80s, and the Catholic Church. If you listen at what Pope Francis has been saying since the start of the war in Ukraine, this is a very anti-US Pope. So Meloni has to manage these constraints in her public opinion and in her constituencies. But still, investments in defense are a weak point in her government's balance sheet and performance. Although Italy has some good companies in the defense sector. Leonardo is the main actor, and Leonardo has been also very active in international joint ventures. One recent joint venture is with Germany for the production of new tanks. And another one, I believe, is with the United Kingdom and Japan for a new fighter jet. But still, Italy is really a laggard, and that's a problem.
I'm really glad you brought up all of these other traditions and undercurrents, because I think from the outside, especially from the US, but even I think for some people in Brussels who just hear from Italy through the persona of Meloni these days, because she's so active on the world stage, it feels like it's a unified opinion on these things. And I think it's similar in France as well. There's always been an anti-American undercurrent. I mean, de Gaulle literally kicked Shape out of France and it ended up across the border in my hometown. But I think it's just important for everyone to keep in mind as we look at Italy is not a monolith around some of these issues. And Meloni has to reckon with these domestic dynamics and the decisions that she makes. Once again, you're setting me up perfectly for the other thing I wanted to talk about, because all of these dynamics I just mentioned, could that become a bit of a sore point in the relationship with the second Trump administration, which so far seems rosy? She was the most prominent European leader at his inauguration. She went to Mar-a-Lago. There's a lot of talk about, her being the bridge and a time where transatlantic relations are likely to be in a difficult spot. Is that picture of her as the bridge accurate, or could these other things be some obstacles in the relationships?
So first of all, I would gladly confirm what you said about the special relation between Giorgia Meloni and Donald Trump. They really seem to have a very good personal chemistry. And obviously, there are also political affinities, ideological affinities. And yes, Giorgia Meloni was, to my knowledge, the only European Prime Minister present at the inauguration. I don't think I saw Viktor Orban. She was probably the only Prime Minister from Europe, which has triggered some controversies back in Italy, because there's already the Democratic Party, the progressive opposition in Italy, saying that she will be completely subservient to Donald Trump, that she is selling out European interests to Donald Trump. So she has to be careful. I think that she will try, first of all, to capitalize on her good relation with Trump in order to limit the damage that Trump can inflict to Italy. On second hand, she will also speak for Europe and try to defend the interests of Europe. But first of all, she will try to mind the business of Italy. And she has two main liabilities. One is the one I already mentioned. She's a laggard in terms of burden sharing inside NATO and defense spending. And Trump is very angry when he sees countries that don't spend enough for their own defense. The second liability is trade, because Italy has, last time I checked the data, the third largest trade surplus on a bilateral basis of a European country with the United States.
President Trump cares about this a lot.
He pays a lot of attention. So the first trade surplus is obviously Germany to the US. The second one, surprisingly, is Ireland, but this is because of Apple, Amazon, all the big tech multinational companies having their European headquarters in Ireland. So this is almost an internal matter inside the United States. Number 3 is Italy. Italy has a large trade surplus, and Italian companies are very, very worried that they will be hit by tariffs. So Meloni, first of all, will try to limit the damage. That's really mission number 1. Because Trump likes her, she will try to have a special treatment. But it won't be easy. She will also speak for Europe, but that won't be her first mission.
Yeah, she doesn't strike me as someone who would let herself become subservient to Donald Trump, at least from the outside. I think probably the good news or the kernel of good news for other European leaders to look at in this picture that you just painted is that because, as you said, it's such a Europeanized economy in Italy, Meloni defending Italian economic interests in the long run is likely to be also a benefit to the protection of European economic interests because all of these things are tied. And if you put tariffs on some European actors, everyone is going to be affected. On the defense side, yes, definitely an area of concern. If I were them, I would probably also be concerned because there's several bases, American and NATO bases in Italy that would probably be a concern should the Trump Defense Department, State Department start looking at, are we going to remove troops from there? I imagine they would be concerned about that.
Yes. Let me add one remark on the fact that due to the weakness of the German government and the French government, Giorgia Meloni has emerged as almost the most important European partner for Donald Trump at this time. But I can foresee that after the German elections in February, if polls are right, if the CDU wins the election, if the next German chancellor will be Mr. Merz, then Meloni will have a big competitor because Mr. Merz also has a lot of features that can please Donald Trump. I mean, he's conservative with similar positions on immigration. He's not a Angela Merkel style conservative, very, very different, much more similar to Trump on several issues. So I think that after February, Merz could be a major competitor to be the main European partner of Donald Trump.
We might have a Game of Thrones situation on our hands come March, but I think this is a great way to leave it. Thank you so much, Federico. That was a really interesting conversation. I'm very glad we were able to drill down on Italy a little bit, and obviously lots to come. We're recording this on day 3 of the second Trump administration, so I hope we can stay in touch.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcast. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producer Shannon Young and to Otto Svensson and Essie Pekkanen for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.